Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today, exciting day in Babylon Talmud. The Bavli is back. Who else is excited? It's pretty awesome. We got a good daf over here in Talmud Bavli, Masechta Yoma. So, new Masechta Yoma. Yoma talks about Yom Kippur. So, we're going to jump in over here. The daf today discusses, so it's the first Mishnah of Masechta Yoma, which talks about the quarantine that the kohen gadol does before Yom Kippur, 7 days of quarantine before Yom Kippur. We discussed the parallel to Para Aduma. That's really kind of the gist of the daf. Some interesting things, other interesting things along the way. So let's just kind of jump in. The first Mishnah of Masechta Yoma, Shivas Yom Kodem Yom HaKippurim. So 7 days before Yom Kippur, so the kohen gadol leaves his house and he comes to the Beis HaMikdash to one of the offices called Lishkas Parhedrin. And we also designate an additional kohen, just in case the kohen gadol maybe sees Keri or somehow becomes puzzled and would be unable to do the service in the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Kippur. So in that event, in that unfortunate event, so we have a backup prepared, right? So maskinin lo kohen acher tachtav, and we prepare an additional kohen to serve in his place just in case the kohen gadol, for whatever reason, becomes unfit to do the service on Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda af isha acheres maskinin lo. So says Rabbi Yehuda, we even, do another thing, which is we designate another wife for him just in case shematamus ishto. Because what would happen in the unlikely event that his wife passes away before Yom Kippur? He needs to have a wife. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, "V'chipur bado vad beiso," that the Eibishter will atone for him, for the kohen gadol, and also his family. Beiso zo ishto, and what's his house? His household is his wife. So therefore, you can't have a kohen gadol do the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash in Yom Kippur if he doesn't have a wife. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says we gotta also line up a backup wife. Amulam kain in the davar sof. The rabbi said to Rabbi Yehuda, "What do you mean, Rabbi Yehuda? If you're gonna be concerned that maybe someone's gonna die, well then what else should we be concerned about? It's a little extreme, I guess, and therefore they disagree and say that you don't need to set aside a just in case wife." Okay, very nice. Says the Gemara Tanan Hasam. We have a Mishnah Dartin. We have a Mishnah Masechta Pareh. What does the Mishnah say? Shivas Yom Kodem Sreifas HaPareh. 7 days before they would burn the Pareh Aduma, right? Of course, we all know what the Pareh Aduma is. It comes up from time to time. If you have a fellow who becomes Tameh, Tumas HaMeis, comes in contact with a corpse, so he becomes an Avatuma, and we have to sprinkle him with Mechatas, water that's mixed together with the ashes of this red heifer. So 7 days before they would slaughter and burn the red heifer, let's read that again. So 7 days before they would burn this Pareh Aduma, so the kohen who is going to be doing this service, right, slaughtering and burning the Pareh Aduma, we would take him away from his house to quarantine for 7 days. Now, we had learned in Masechta Shkalim Taka, right? We had seen that every kohen gadol would redo that ramp from the Beis HaMikdash to where they would do the Seifas Pareh Aduma, which sounded like it was Dafka the kohen gadol that would do this avodah as well. But I don't think it has to be. So 7 days before the Seifas Pareh Aduma, the kohen who was going to be doing the service would quarantine. And they would take him to one of the offices in the Beis HaMikdash. And this office, right, this was called the stone office. And we're going to explain why it was called the stone office in just a second. The kohen who was going to do this avoda, he would quarantine for 7 days in this stone office in the north. Did we read that already? Yes, we did. In the northeast of the Azara. Okay, so basically imagine walking into Azara, so all the way to the right, in that corner all the way to the right, there would be an office called the Lishkas Beis HaEvan, and that is where the Kohen who was going to be doing the avoda of Sreifas Parah Aduma, that's where he would quarantine for 7 days. How come they called this office where the Parah Aduma quarantine would take place, how come it was called the stone office? Because all of the procedures of the Parah Aduma were done with clay galolim, with vessels made out of dung, b'chlei avonim, vessels made out of stone, b'chlei adama, and vessels made out of earth. My time, how come? Came the tvul yom kosher b'parah, because since a tvul yom is kosher to do the avoda of the Sreifas Parah Aduma, the Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, interesting. So they would deliberately be mitame the kohen who would do the burning of the Parah Aduma. They would throw a dead sheretz at him, like we learned in Masechta Pesachim, in a different context, of course. But they would take a dead sheretz, chuck it at the kohen who was going to do the Sreifas Parah Aduma, deliberately make him tamei tumas erev, umatbilin also, and then they put him in the mikvah, and he becomes a tvul yom. And davka, a tvul yom, would do the Sreifas Parah Aduma lahotzi miliban shel tzidukin, so that to make it clear that it is unlike the tzidukim shayu omrim, who would say b'ma'orave Hashem m'shaysanaisis, that the Sreifas Parah Aduma davka had to be done by somebody who is tahor. So they would go out of their way in order to make it clear, to make the point that the halacha is not like the tzidukim, that you need somebody who is completely pure in order to do the Sreifas Parah Aduma. They would take a dead sheretz, throw it at the kohen who was going to do the Sreifas Parah Aduma, put him in the mikvah, deliberately make him a tvul yom, and then he would do the avoda. And therefore, takinu larabanan klei galalim klei avonim uchlei adama lo lekablu tuma, and that is why the Chachamim then said that to make up for this, and we're going to see in just a second what we mean by that, all of the processes of the Parah Aduma should be done with klei galalim, klei avonim, klei adama, things that are not mekabel tuma, so that people shouldn't take Parah Aduma lightly. Because after all, if you're going to be taking a dead sheretz and chucking it at the kohen who's going to do the Sreifas Parah Aduma, I can imagine people would be saying, oh, the kohen can be tamei, even, it can even be a tvul yom could do Sreifas Parah Aduma. It must not be that big of a deal. So to make up for that, and to make it clear that no, it's something that we want you to take seriously, and the only reason why we have a tvul yom doing the Sreifas Parah Aduma is because of political considerations, that we want to make it clear that the tzedukim are wrong. So that's why we have a tvul yom do the Sreifas Parah Aduma. However, do not think that we should be taking this mitzvah lightly, and to make up for that, and to show that we are serious about that, so all the processes of the Sreifas Parah Aduma are done specifically with vessels that are unable to be makabel tuma, to show that we do take the purity of the Sreifas Parah Aduma seriously. Okay. How come this Lishkas Beis HaEvan was specifically in the northeast of the Azara? So here's the answer. Kevin dechatasi, bechatas tu netzafin. Well, the Parah Aduma is called a chatas. Why is it called a chatas? What does the pasuk say? It says lemenida chatasi. It says in the context of the parah aduma that it is sprinkling water for korban chatas. Now, okay, and therefore, and the korban chatas is slaughtered in the north of the Azara. Now, the parah aduma is not slaughtered in the Azara at all. It's slaughtered on Har Hazeisim. However, because the parah aduma is called a chatas, therefore we want this office to be in the north of the Azara. Let's go weiter for a second. And it also says that when you do the sprinkling of the blood of the parah aduma, that is also on Har Hazeisim. However, it says that it should be opposite the face of the Ol Moed, that you should be able to see into the Azara. I think some opinions even you should be able to see into the Ulam when he's sprinkling the blood of the parah aduma on Har Hazeisim. And therefore, for these two reasons, because there's the characteristic of the chatos. Now, in general, korban chatas is slaughtered in the north, and there's the characteristic of you want the zrikas adam to be opposite the face of the Azara, which is the east. So therefore, the office where he quarantines is in the northeast of the Azara. Let's go weiter. Takinu la rabbanan lishkat tzvonim mizrachis. So therefore, the rabbi said that this office where he's going to quarantine for a week should be in the northeast of the Azara, so that he'll remember, so that it should be clear that this is an office for the parah aduma. How come the Lishkas Beis Even is in the northeast? Because everything about this office should remind you about the parah aduma. It's in the north because the parah aduma is called a chatas, and it's in the east because el nochach pnei ol moed, that the zrikas adam of the parah aduma should be in the east. That is why when choosing a location for the Lishkas Beis Even, northeast is an appropriate location. My bira, what is the bira? This came up most recently in Masechta Shkalim. It also came up in Masechta Pesachim. What is the bira? So the answer is it's machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Makom Haya by Rabbi Suvirishma. So it says Rabbi Bar Chana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the bira is davka a specific place in Har Habayis, on the Temple Mount. So there was a specific place on Har Habayis, and it was called bira, and that's what bira is. Whereas Rish Lakish argues, Rish Lakish Amar Kol HaMikdash Kulo Kari Bira. Shenemar Abira Asher Achinosi. Says Rish Lakish that Taka, the entire Har Habayis was called the bira. The bira is Pashat, the Beis HaMikdash. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's a specific place in the Beis HaMikdash. According to Rish Lakish, it's the entire Beis HaMikdash is called the bira. Very interesting. Because bira comes up from time to time, and it's one of those things that it's like, what exactly is this? Well, it's taka machlokas. Right? Because they say, for example, psule kachim kalim, or certain psule kachim, right? We had learned at the end of Masechta Shkalim. Was it taka yesterday even? That there are certain things that you burn in the Azara, certain things that you burn outside the Azara. So if you burn it outside the Azara, believe that you burn it at the bira. So we're saying that the bira, so it's machlokas, is it anywhere in Har Habayis, or is it a specific place in Har Habayis? So how do we know that by parah aduma and by Yom Kippur there's a requirement for quarantine 7 days beforehand? Amar ben Yomi by Chilkia, Amar Mechase by Idi, Amar Yochanan, Amar Kra. Kasher also by Yom Hazeh, Tziva Hashem, Lasas L'chaper Aleichem. This pasuk is in the context of the Miluim. Who could tell me what the Miluim are? The Miluim were the 7 days leading up to the Yom HaShmini. Take, what was it, this week's Parsha, last week's Parsha Shmini. Vahi ba Yom HaShmini, it was on the 8th day. The 8th day of what? The 8th day of the Miluim. That for 7 days up till Rosh Chodesh Nisan, I believe it was the second year in the Midbar, when they had the inauguration of the Mishkan on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So the 7 days prior was what's called the Yemei Miluim. 7 days of, I guess, preparation. It was the days that it was through this 7 day period that Aaron and his children were sort of made into the Kohanim. That was like their training period, so to speak, their onboarding, whatever it is. Moshe Rabbeinu did the avoda in the Mishkan for that week, and it was through that Aaron and his children sort of got their training. And then on the 8th day, which was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, already then they had the inauguration of the Mishkan, 12 days of Korbanos from the Nesiim, and by then Aharon and his children were doing the Avoda. So there was 7 days leading up to this 8th day, which is when Aharon and his children then became the kohen gadol and the kohanim respectively. And for those 7 days, as Rashi points out, the pasuk says, the second to last Rashi on the page, Ufesacho hamoed teshvu yomim v'layla, that during that week you will remain in the Mishkan the entire, day and night. So we see that for the 7 days leading up to the Yom HaShmini, leading up to the day of the inauguration of the Mishkan, for that entire week, Aharon and his children quarantined essentially in the Mishkan. So from there, we're now going to learn that there's a requirement for 7 days of quarantine for the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur, and for whoever's going to be doing the Avodah Seifas HaPareh before the burning of the Parah Aduma. So again, the pasuk says, "Kasher also by Yom Hazeh," just like he did on this day. Tziva Hashem la'asos l'chaper aleichem, the Eibishter commanded to atone for you. La'asos, when the pasuk says la'asos, ilumaise pareh, that's a reference to the Parah Aduma, that when you burn the Parah Aduma, there should be 7 days of quarantine beforehand. L'chaper, and when it says l'chaper, what do you think it's talking about? Ilumaise Yom Kippurim, that's a reference to Yom Kippur, that the Kohen Gadol should quarantine for 7 days before Yom Kippur. B'shlama kulei kram, b'pareh lo mesukam, l'chaper ksiv, u'fareh la bas kapari. So I understand why we're going to say that pasuk is not entirely talking about Parah Aduma, because the pasuk specifically says l'chaper, and there's no kapara inherent in Parah Aduma, although, come to think of it, kapara, so there is kind of a para in there, but that wouldn't be the literal pshat. The literal pshat is kapara is atonement, and there's no atonement attained through the Parah Aduma. There is purity attained. Yutami tumas hameis, Parah Aduma makes you tar, but there's no atonement from sin. So therefore, I understand why this pasuk that says l'chaper aleichem cannot entirely be talking about Parah Aduma, because Parah Aduma doesn't have to do with kapara. However, ele'emu kulei krab yom kippurim ksiv. But can't we argue that this pasuk is only talking about Yom Kippur? It has nothing to do with Parah Aduma. And maybe it's saying that just like there was the 7 days prior to the Yom HaShmini, to the inauguration of the Mishkan, so we also have 7 days of quarantine before Yom Kippur, and that's it. Nothing to do with Parah Aduma. Amr Yalav Tziva Tziva. To which the Gemara answers, we have a Gzera Shava. We have a Gzera Shava that proves that just like there was 7 days of quarantine by the Miluim, there's also 7 days of quarantine by the Parah Aduma. Ksiv Hasam, it says by Parah Aduma, Zoschuka Satorah Shetziva Hashem. So it says Tziva, Lemor, Malahalon. Wait, did I skip? I skipped. Yolav Tziva Tziva. Ksiv Hacha, it says by quarantine, by the Yimei Miluim, Tziva Hashem La'asos. So it says the word Tziva. Uksiv Hasam, and it says by Parah Aduma, so it says Tziva by Miluim, it says Tziva by Parah Aduma, Ma Lohalon, Para Avkan Para. So just like by, interesting. So just like by Parah Aduma, we're talking about a para. So also by the Miluim, we're talking about a para. Okay. Avkan Prisha, Ma'umakan Prisha Aflalam Prisha. Just like by the Miluim, there was 7 days of quarantine, so also by the Parah Aduma, we have 7 days of quarantine. For the Gemara, Ve'metziva Tziva Yom Kippurim, but maybe I'll say that this Gezer Shav of Tziva Tziva is not saying that just like by the Miluim, there was 7 days quarantine, also by the Parah Aduma, there's 7 days quarantine. There's a pasuk by Yom Kippur that says Tziva. So maybe the Gezer Shav of Tziva Tziva is from Miluim and Yom Kippur, not Miluim and Parah Aduma. Dichsev, as the pasuk says by Yom Kippur, Vayas Kasher Tziva Hashem is Moshe, that Aharon did as God commanded Moshe. So it says Tziva by Yom Kippur also. So why don't we say that specifically by Yom Kippur you need quarantine just like by the Miluim, but not Parah Aduma? Says the Gemara, Don and Tziva delifnei asiyah, mitziva delifnei asiyah, vein don and Tziva delachar asiyah, mitziva delifnei asiyah. Let's read that again. The Gemara answers, don't say like that, because Don and Tziva delifnei asiyah, we will learn out Tziva that is in the context of before the mitzvah has been done. Like Para Aduma, where it says, Zos chukas haTorah asher tziva Hashem, and then it proceeds to explain what the halachas of Para Aduma are. Mitziva delifnei asiyah, from a commandment before the asiyah, like the Miluim, that the commandment of the 7 days was before the 8th day, where that pasuk took place, was written before the day of action, which was the 8th day, which was when Aharon and his children actually started doing the avodah. Ve'ein don et tziva delachar asiyah, we don't learn out a tziva, a word tziva, in the context where the avodah has already been done, where the mitzvah has already been done, such as in the case of Yom Kippur, it was after the description of all the avodas of Yom Kippur, it says that pasuk, mitziva delifnei asiyah, from a tziva before the asiyah, which is by the miluim. And therefore, if we have a choice where, or if we have to really decide and understand and determine where is this Gzeir Shava, is the Gzeir Shava by Yom Kippur, or is it by Para Aduma? The answer is it's by Para Aduma, because when the word tziva, which we're using for our Gzeir Shava, is written in the case of Para Aduma, it's before the avodah, the mitzvah of the Para Aduma has been done, and that is parallel, that's equivalent to Miluim, where the Miluim had not yet been done at the time, as opposed to Yom Kippur, the pasuk was written after the avodah had been done, and that is how we know that the Gzeir Shava is from Miluim to Para Aduma, and Para Aduma requires 7 days of quarantine. Ve'ema tziva de korbanis, but fact the Gemara, what about the fact that in the context of the korbanis, of sacrifices, it also says the word tziva. Dichsiv, the pasuk says, B'yom tzavoso as b'nei Yisrael, on the day that he commanded b'nei Yisrael. So it says tzavoso in the context of offerings, and therefore I might think that whenever you have a korban, any fellow who brings a korban, so then the people, the kohanim in the Beis Hamikdash who are doing the avodah of the korbanos should have to quarantine for 7 days before they do the avodah of the korbanos. So the Gemara answers, done in tziva mitziva vein done in tzavoso mitziva. The Gemara answers, no, that's not going to be a good Gezer Shava, because the pasuk by Miluim says tziva, whereas the pasuk by korbanos says tzavoso. And therefore, we're going to learn out tziva by Para Aduma from tziva by Miluim, but not tzavoso by korbanos. That's a different word. It's not an exact match. Umay nafkemina. The Gemara says, who cares that it's not an exact match? Who says you need an exact match? V'atana de Rabbi Shmuel was taught by the dispensation of Rabbi Shmuel. V'shava kohen uva kohen zoi shiva zoi bia. It says in the context of tzaras, I believe tzaras of a house. V'shava kohen uva kohen. It says in one pasuk v'shava kohen. It says in another pasuk uva kohen. Two completely different words, and yet we say zoi shiva zoi bia. We can treat Shiva and Bia as the same to be able to learn out one pasuk from the other in Gzeir Shava, and they're completely different words. So if we could say that Vishav and Uva is close enough to make Gzeir Shava, certainly Tzavoso and Sav, which have the same Shoresh, should be enough to be able to make Gzeir Shava. And for the Gemara, Hanemile Echa Deleka Dedamile. To which the Gemara says, well, look, we were kind of in a rough spot over there by Tzaraz because there wasn't any better match. That was what we had, so we're working with what we had. Vishav, Uva, that's what we have, that's what the Gzeir Shava is. That, right? Because the way that Gzeir Shavas work, interestingly, you can't just make up a Gzeir Shava. It's not like that. You can't make up a Gzeir Shava. You have to have a tradition for a Gzeir Shava. And therefore, over here, there was a tradition that there's a Gezer Shava of Tziva. And we have to figure out what do we do with this Gezer Shava? Is it talking about Yom Kippur? Is it talking about Para Aduma? Is it talking about Korbanos? And we rule out Korbanos because Korbanos says Tzavoso, and whereas by Yom Kippur and Parah Aduma, it says Tziva. So those are closer matches. We ruled out Yom Kippur just because the Avodah had already been done, so it must be talking about Parah Aduma. But Korbanos is out of the question because Tzavoso is not an exact match with Tziva. However, when we add the tradition of the Gzeir Shava by Tzara'as, there was no exact match. So therefore, it was impossible to find an exact match to say that that's what the tradition of the Gzeir Shava by Tzara'as is, and therefore we're working within the limits and the constraints of what there was available, and Vishav Uva was the closest thing available, so we say that that must be what the Gzeir Shava is talking about. However, since we do have exact matches in the context of the quarantine, therefore we're going to rule out Korbanos, say that the only real options, the real contenders are Yom Kippur and Parah Aduma. Yom Kippur, the Avodah had already been done, the mitzvah was already done at the time of the writing of the Pasuk, therefore it must be that Parah Aduma, where the Tziva was written before the mitzvah was done, which is parallel to the Miluim, where the Pasuk was before the mitzvah had been done on the 8th day. So that is where the Gzeir Shava is going to be, and that's how we know that by Parah Aduma we require quarantine 7 days before the Seifas Parah Aduma. Great. So we've just kind of established that by Parah Aduma we require a quarantine of 7 days because we have the pasuk, because we have the Gzeir Shava. Now, moving on. L'chaper elu ma'aseh Yoma Kippurim. So that pasuk says, right? Kasher tziva Hashem. Kasher also b'yom hazeh tziva Hashem lasos l'chaper aleichem. So we said that. So we want to say that lasos is a reference to Parah Aduma. We asked kashas. We ended up proving it from Gzeir Shava. That's kind of that. So we're done with Parah Aduma. Requires quarantine of 7 days. Now we said l'chaper is a reference to Yom Kippur. That's how we know that the kohen gadol needs to quarantine for 7 days. Frak the Gemara. Ve'ema kapar de korbanis. Maybe it's talking about the korbanis of right. So say it's talking about the kapara of korbanis. That when a fellow needs atonement, so he brings a korban. Maybe the kohen who's doing the avoda, who's doing the service in the Mishkan, in the Beis HaMikdash for this korban that somebody's bringing, maybe that kohen had to do quarantine for 7 days. So miyadina nehe kohen misrame devayle prisha, to which the Gemara says, yeah, but how are we going to know which kohen should do quarantine for 7 days? Because after all, everything in the Beis HaMikdash was done by lottery. They would have lotteries every day in the Beis HaMikdash, and that's how they would figure out which kohen would do what. And therefore, how are you going to know in advance which kohen is going to be doing the service in the Beis HaMikdash for these individual korbanos that people are bringing, that you should require quarantine for 7 days? So it's not practical. Amri alamalo, nibayle pisha l'chule mishmeres beisav. To which the Gemara says, come on, that's not a good answer. Let's just say that everybody needs to quarantine. There were 24 mishmaros. Each mishmar would have a different week in the Beis HaMikdash that they would work. Within the mishmar, they were divided into 6 batei avos, right? Each Beis Av would work 1 day throughout the week. So you knew which day of the week you're going to be working. So 7 days before that day, quarantine. Everybody in the Beis Av should quarantine. And then, memele, if you're the one doing the avodah, so then you quarantine for 7 days. What's the problem? Just make everybody quarantine. So the Gemara answers, well, korbanos are every single day, whereas the miluim was a specific day, the Yoma Shmini, was on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Lafuke korbanos l'chol Yoma isnu, right? So korbanos are every single day. The Yom HaShmini was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, a specific day. And therefore, that's what we're looking for in terms of what this pasuk is talking about. And Yom Kippur fits the bill. The 10th day of Tishrei. It's Yom Kippur. It's 1 day a year. And therefore, if we're saying that when the pasuk says L'chaper, what's it talking about? It's talking about Yom Kippur. Because that pasuk is in the context of Miluim. Miluim was a specific day. Yom Kippur is a specific day. That makes sense. However, korbanos in general, there's no specific day for that. It's every day. So that's out of the question. Ve'ema regalim. What about the shalosh regalim? Maybe it's saying that the kohanim would do the avodah on the shalosh regalim. They need to quarantine for 7 days. It's not every single day. To which Gemara says, yeah, but the Shmini Lamiluim was 1 day in the year, whereas the Shalosh Regalim is obviously 3 times a year. So therefore it's too different. Yom Kippur is 1 day a year. So that's what we're going to say that the pasuk is talking about. Okay, but why don't we just choose one of the Shalosh Regalim? Sukkos, let's say. Any of the Kohanim who are going to do the Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash on Sukkos need to quarantine for 7 days. So v'chitema lo yadina neminayu. And if you're going to say, yeah, but we don't know which one, there's 3 of them. How do we know which of the Shalosh Regalim? So I'll give you reasons. I can make arguments. Ichagamatzes, ho'alufasach ba'akosov tchila. I don't know, maybe we should say Pesach. The Kohanim in the Beis Hamikdash before Pesach, they should quarantine for 7 days. Why Pesach? Because it's always, whenever we have the Shalosh Regalim in the Torah, Pesach's always first. So I can argue that specifically by Pesach, the Kohanim should quarantine for 7 days. Okay, or can argue that maybe it's talking about Sukkot. So Alam Ruba Mitzvasu, since there's lots of mitzvahs on Sukkot. Lulav Esrig, Hadas Maravis. So maybe it's Taka Sukkah. I can make arguments. So let's say that L'chaper is talking about the Shalosh Regalim. There's 3 of them. Alright, maybe it's talking about Pesach. So Ela done in Prisha Shiva Liyom Echad, Mi Prisha Shiva Liyom Echad, Vein done in Prisha Shiva L'Shiva, Mi Prisha Shiva Liyom Echad. So the Gemara answers, forget about it. Shalosh Regalim is not a good comparison, Bichlal anyways, because Miluim was 7 days of quarantine for a specific day, for the 8th day. And that's what we're looking for. Yom Kippur fits that bill. You quarantine for 7 days, and then it's Yom Kippur. The Shalosh Regalim, Pesach and Sukkot, and you're going to notice conspicuously that Shavuos is missing. We'll get to that tomorrow. But by Pesach and Sukkot, those are 7-day festivals. So if you would have to quarantine for 7 days beforehand, you'd basically be quarantining for 7 days, leading up to an additional 7-day festival. That's not a good comparison with the Miluim, where it was a quarantine of 7 days for a 1-day event, the Yemei HaMiluim. And therefore, we're looking for a comparison with something similar, and Yom Kippur fits that bill, where it's 7 days of quarantine for the 1 day of Yom Kippur. Ve'ema Shmini, the Prishas Shiva L'Yom Echad, but what about Shmini Atzeres? Shmini Atzeres is its own festival. So therefore, why don't we say 7 days before Shmini Atzeres, whoever's going to do the Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash needs to quarantine. And it would be 7 days of quarantine for 1 day, for Shmini Atzeres. So the Gemara answers, Davar she'en kedusha lefanav, midavar she'en kedusha lefanav, ve'en davar she'esh kedusha lefanav, midavar she'en kedusha lefanav. We say that the difference is, Shmini Atzeres is unique in that the 7 days prior to Shmini Atzeres have kedusha, are holy. It's the 7 days of Sukkot. As opposed to the Miluim, the 7 days before the Miluim were just regular days. The 7 days before Yom Kippur are regular days. So therefore, when we're looking to figure out what we need quarantine for, we need it for something that it's 7 regular days leading up to a specific day. Shmini Atzeres, however, is 7 holy days leading up to a specific day, so we rule that out. To which the Gemara says, come on, that doesn't really make sense. Lav Kavachomeru, isn't it logical that I can argue that Kavachomer, obviously Shmini Atzeres should require quarantine? If the Yemei Miluim, which do not have 7 holy days leading up to them, and yet we require quarantine, certainly Shmini Atzeres, which has 7 holy days leading up to it, should require quarantine. It's a more significant case. Rav Mishasha lo. Hazek siv kazeh. Rav Mishasha says no. The pasuk says by the Miluim, it says hazeh. Kasher also bayom hazeh. So it means kazeh, like this. That it should be a case that is just like this. And therefore, yeah, I can make the argument that, well, Kal Vachomer, if there's 7 holy days leading up to Shmini Atzeres, certainly it should require quarantine. No. The pasuk says hazeh, kazeh, like this. And we want to find an example that is just like this. Don't make your arguments. Don't make your fancy logical arguments. We don't want them. We just want a case that is similar to this, that is similar to the Miluim. The Miluim had 7 ordinary days leading up to them, to the Yom HaShmini. So also Yom Kippur is a good candidate because it has 7 ordinary days leading up to the holy day of Yom Kippur, to the exclusion of Shmini Atzeres. As fancy as it sounds, we're not looking for something that has 7 holy days leading up to the target day, which in this case would be Shmini Atzeres. Rather, we learn out that Yom Kippur requires 7 days of quarantine for the kohen gadol. That was Daf Beis of Masechta Yoma. On a scale of 1 to 10, 11, right? So let's do a shtickle review. So what do we talk about today on Daf Beis of Yoma? So there's 2. We started out with the first mission of Masechta Yoma, which says that the kohen gadol needs to quarantine for 7 days before Yom Kippur, just to make sure that he's not going to become tameh. So we can keep an eye on him. To which we immediately got into the parallel to Para Aduma, that by Para Aduma also the kohen who burns the Para Aduma needs to quarantine for 7 days beforehand to make sure that he remains tahor. Also we saw in Masechta Shkalim, right? This is nothing. I think in Masechta Sukkah they talk about even the real extremes that they go in to make sure that the Para Aduma remains tahor. But we saw Masechta Shkalim also in terms of the ramp to make sure that they would make the special ramp so that there shouldn't be any chashash of tumas hameis. Anyways. And then we, let's go, okay, fine, very good. There was an interesting machlokas in the middle about what exactly the bira is. Machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says that the bira is a specific place in Har HaBayis. Rish Lakish says that the bira is all of Har HaBayis, okay? And then really, we then spent about half the daf trying to convince ourselves and be 100% certain that the places other than the Miluim that require quarantine are in fact Yom Kippur and Para Aduma. We proved Para Aduma from Gzeira Shava of Tziva Tziva. Yom Kippur, we are still in the process of proving that Yom Kippur is in fact the place that should require quarantine, because we're bringing all sorts of arguments that maybe we should assume it's a different case, maybe it's Korbanis, maybe it's Shalosh Regalim. So we're still in the middle of that process. Cheve, have a great day. Peace out.